This is one reason why I was glad that I got into like memory research where, I can say that, hey, by having new learning in an otherwise slow learning memory system, we might be able to disrupt maladaptive beliefs. For example, like somebody who, has had depression. To them, George Washington, first president of the country, I'm a shitty human being. Like those two things feel the exact same truth.
This interview is one that I think will touch on a story that I imagine a good number of people listening to this are already familiar with. On September 24th, 2025, the New York Times published a really uncomfortable story about a billionaire businesswoman named Amy Griffin, who is the financier of a number of female-oriented technologies and products like the media company Goop, Bumble, Goop Kitchen, the levonorgestrel emergency contraceptive company Julie, Spanx, Supergoop, whatever that is, probably some others, in addition to being married to a independent other billionaire. So this is someone with tremendous financial resources who published a book called The Tell that detailed the use of underground MDMA psychotherapy that resulted in the recovery of memories of sexual abuse as a high school student. The book was tremendously successful, and she went on a media tour that involved Oprah Winfrey, and I didn't read the book. I wasn't really aware of the story, and even when the original expose came out, people would say, ooh, this Amy Griffin thing, wow, this is really unsettling. And I just didn't get into it. I sort of didn't have the bandwidth to do any kind of a deep dive on the story. And Dr. Manoj Doss, probably the leading expert on the effects of psychedelics on memory, happened to be in New York City and stopped by for a podcast. And on the same day that he arrived, like 2 hours before the interview, the New York Times published another story. This was on March 5th, that made a pretty unsettling claim that not only is there reason to be suspicious of the recovered memories that are detailed in The Tell, but that a lawsuit had been filed by one of Amy Griffin's high school classmates who claims that the stories of abuse were stolen by Amy Griffin and then used to write this best-selling book. I didn't like the characterization of MDMA as an illegal drug, which kind of makes it sound bad, or it makes it sound like the illegality is connected to the problems associated with Amy Griffin's book. And I saw people repeating this in some of the discussions on Reddit, like, you're going to believe a woman that used an illegal drug in underground psychotherapy? It just was another sad ramification of how prohibition colors the way people perceive these things. The legality of MDMA has no direct bearing on its pharmacology, and presumably these sorts of problems could exist in a legal framework as well. So that seemed like a kind of misguided characterization, even if it's technically correct. But the story made me aware that this is a bigger issue than I had realized. It raises really interesting questions. And while I think that the most nefarious interpretation is possible, I also wonder about, and of course this is purely speculative, all sorts of intermediate possibilities. Maybe Amy Griffin remembered the abuse of her classmate. Maybe the underground therapist said, "Are you sure that that classmate wasn't you?" And maybe under the influence of MDMA, there was some conflation of their stories. The lawsuit makes it sound as if that was not the case. And then maybe positive feedback associated with these stories, coupled with the attention associated with the book and believing in MDMA, caused this very strange and scandalous thing to have occurred. And this also, of course, sometimes people will say that I am opposed to any kind of writing or reporting that has negative bearing on drugs. That is absolutely not the case. And I think this is a good example. If what appears to have happened did in fact happen, it represents quite a few problems. It shows a potential problem with precipitation of false memories, a problem with what sorts of stories are elevated and what sorts of experiences they motivate and what sorts of hidden agendas the people telling those stories might have, and on and on and on. Is this some kind of horrifying indictment of MAPS? No, of course not. It's far weirder and more complicated than that, but it's a important story to follow, and I think it's very interesting. It also appears to have been the subject of a recent episode of Law & Order SVU.
You said you remember this while you were in therapy. Can you talk to us more about that?
It was a clinical trial for PTSD. I was on a psychedelic.
But this discussion with Dr. Doss is not just about Amy Griffin. We talk about the illusory truth effect, how psychedelics change perception and insight. We talk about Pizzagate. We talk about Epstein. We talk about Epstein at a time when things were evolving so rapidly that some of the comments that we made are already dated. For example, Manoj makes a comment about how there was no involvement with Epstein in drugs, which I think at the time that he said that was true, and then a bunch of reporting came out suggesting the DEA was monitoring him for ketamine trafficking. The reporting on that contained very few details, so I'm not quite sure about it, but I can't help but wonder if the Epstein price list that I tweeted, which went viral, was removed from the government Epstein file database because it was part of the DEA investigation. Again, no evidence for that, just an interesting possibility. It's also always fascinating to have these discussions about memory and how we can misperceive or misremember various things, and then go back and listen to the conversation and scrutinize everything that I said and see all the small errors. For example, I say that Amy Griffin supposedly contacted the actual sexual assault victim for a documentary, but they don't say documentary in the lawsuit. In the lawsuit, they say film. Or I say that Carl Sagan came up with the idea for the movie Contact while stoned in a shower. And while I was almost certain that I had heard that, Carl Sagan actually had an epiphany about the invalidity of racism while stoned in a shower and wrote Contact while stoned, but apparently there was no shower involvement. So this is a fascinating discussion. I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. Manoj Doss, and there's a lot more coming out soon. But I do want to talk about the Amy Griffin story, because when this came out 6 or so months ago, I was so saturated with MDMA-associated scandal that I didn't even look at it very carefully. I remember people were bringing it up, and I didn't read the New York Times article and kind of ignored the whole thing. And then you said you were coming to New York, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna dig into this because you're the expert on false memories. And then like 2 hours ago, the New York Times published an update to this story and further complicate the already extremely complicated story, which was like, I'm sure, an absolute nightmare to report. Like, I wrote to the journalist this morning and asked if she would talk to me about it, and she basically said no, because this is a story that pissed off absolutely everyone. Psychedelic proponents hated it because it made psychedelics look bad. Sexual abuse related people hated it because it is a story of somebody potentially fabricating a story of assault, which makes everyone...
Or like questioning their assault, that happened, right? Yeah.
Like everything about it made it's like a story that had something to bother absolutely everyone. And were you following that when it came out?
Yeah, no. And I mean, I think there was a couple people that reached out to me. I think there's an article on Bustle or something like that. And I mean, to be honest, I kind of thought that, from the original New York Times article that, like, my stance on this is that it seems highly implausible without drugs to recover memories, that people don't tend to like forget their trauma. That's the problem with PTSD, right? Is that they can't forget it, whereas most people kind of, can let things go. They go fight in a war or whatever. Most people don't come back with PTSD, and then they're able to kind of let go of some of these events, but then some people do. Some people don't forget. And then they kind of stick to it, and there's avoidance, but they're not forgetting it. There's not like a recovery of it. So then, you throw drugs in there, and at least with every drug I've tested on an objective memory test where we look at how people can like retrieve a memory that they previously formed, it just looks like people, come up with, they say they saw things they never did, And so in this case, I was kind of thinking, well, maybe, she really does believe it, right? Like that was kind of where I was going with it, but it's highly unlikely she actually like recovered a memory. But, I believe that she believes it, or I believed she believed it. I just didn't believe necessarily that it happened. But now this new story, I mean, it's currently, an accusation, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that that happened, but it does sound a little sketchy, yeah. I mean, but part of me was just like, why would she need to, create this story and like boost her brand? Like I kind of thought the New York Times article, the first one, was a little bit like, that was kind of like what they were alluding to. It was like, oh, she's just trying to boost her brand, And then, but I was kind of thinking, I was like, she probably actually believes this, that this happened to her, on MDMA. And maybe it's still possible, right? That, it's easily possible, like there's this whole thing like source confusions in memory where something can happen and then you can confuse the source of where it happened. Like, did it happen in your imagination or did it actually happen to you, And people will confuse their imagination with what happened. And perhaps that's more likely with something like MDMA. And, she heard the story from her classmate and then kind of got confused with what happened there. She might actually believe it still, but it does sound a little, I mean, I don't want to make any statements and get sued, so.
Well, there was a sort of, I would say, borderline conspiratorial dimension to the original New York Times report, which was, this isn't just somebody who recovered a potentially false memory under the influence of MDMA. This is a billionaire who was a major MAPS donor, who then went on a massive publicity tour extolling the virtues of this therapy. And so, although of course he didn't explicitly say it, the implication was that there was maybe even some form of collusion. Rick Doblin connects Amy Griffin with this underground therapist. She recovers these memories. She writes a best-selling book. She does a massive publicity tour, tells all kinds of normal Gwyneth Paltrow, Oprah Winfrey type people about how this therapy rescued her. So this makes MDMA therapy look very good. And
yeah, but Rick, it's funny because there was a comment he has in there, and I can't remember exactly what he said. He said something along the lines of like, well, because I think I've talked to him about this a little bit, and I think I was on stage with him one time talking about this. And I know he said before that, he said something like, oh, it's, unclear if MDMA can, help you retrieve memories. Maybe even certain things can be false memories. Like he says this in some article, but then later on, I think he like contacts them again and then says, oh, but I believe Amy,
Yes.
Something like that. Like there was almost but I don't know if that was like collusion or it's like, well, I don't, he doesn't want to like ruin his relationship with her,
Doesn't want to ruin his relationship with her. And on top of that, I would assume that he wasn't aware of the depth of the New York Times investigation. I doubt they showed him a draft of the story and laid all the evidence out for him. Maybe they did. I guess I could ask him. But he probably didn't know exactly what appears to have happened.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems messy and yeah, exactly. You don't want to, be a man denying somebody, of these things. But one thing I'll say about the MeToo movement, as far as I know, there was not a single case out of all the like high profile cases of the MeToo movement between, let's say, 2015 to 2020 or something. in which somebody said that they recovered a memory. You know, if anything, they said they didn't want to talk about it because it was too hurtful. They thought that somebody, they didn't think anybody was going to believe them. They thought that, some, A-list celebrity was going to blackball them. No one said they recovered a memory, right? Like, as far as I know, can you think of a case where somebody said other than this one right now?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think that was a part of this. But I also must admit that I have been bizarrely oblivious to how prevalent this is. I didn't realize, for example, I knew that Tim Ferriss had done a podcast about sexual abuse as a child, and a friend of mine who was sexually abused as a child told me about it and said, you have to listen to this. It's really moving, and it's really important that he came forward about this. This was in 2020, and I never listened to it. So not just because I know him, and I guess I was like vaguely uncomfortable listening to it or something. I don't know why I didn't listen to it, but I didn't realize that it was a recovered memory that he had, that was precipitated by using ayahuasca. I also didn't know that Catherine McLean had precipitated a memory under the influence of psilocybin. So I didn't realize that this is actually not just this fringe thing, but many important people in the psychedelic movement have also recovered memories of sexual abuse under the influence of psychedelics.
Yeah, and I mean, I was just, down at UPenn and talking to people, and numerous people had, their cases that they've heard, right? But I mean, it's kind of hard sometimes to distinguish these things between, is it a recovered memory, or is it, for example, someone can, not realize that what, the game they played, let's say, with their uncle was actually sexual abuse, right? It's one thing, it's like, okay, me and my uncle played this game when, you're young and you don't really know, how to interpret these sorts of events. And then later on, you're learning about sex in a completely different environment in like fifth grade, in a fifth grade classroom or something. Or even, your friends telling you on the bus or something along those lines, and you don't connect those two things. So that's like, and then later on down the line, you're like, wait a minute. Oh, there's this thing, sexual abuse. Oh my God, that happened to me. I think that's something that's happened to people where they don't connect the dots. There's also like cases of like just not, necessarily thinking about it. Like I was talking to, my sister about like, something that my dad did. And she was like, oh yeah, remember that thing? And I was like, oh my God, he did do that, He put me on the refrigerator one time. Indian parents can be brutal sometimes. And it wasn't a recovered memory. It was just like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that in ages, Yeah.
Yeah.
Like 4 years old, yeah.
Or reinterpreting an existing memory.
Yeah, which I think that's the first thing I was saying, that first case of a reinterpretation.
Since the early 18th century, ethnographic reports have documented the Chukchi practice of drinking urine infused with the metabolites of the psychoactive mushroom Amanita muscaria.
Oh.
There's got to be a better way. Amanterra.com offers gummies infused with 100 milligrams of Amanita muscaria extract. Use the discount code Hamilton for 22% off any of Amanterra's ethnobotanical offerings.
But to like truly, like sit there and like, especially with, we've had it in our face so much now, these cases of like sexual abuse, and then to not think back to like, so I've heard people say, for example, well, I've had cases of like, I think other people would have found this to be a particularly negative experience. It wasn't positive for me, but like, it was like this subtle, maybe not subtle, but it wasn't a good situation, but I didn't feel traumatized by it. They've like reevaluated events like that where they're like, well, that wasn't a good sexual situation to be in, but, I'm not traumatized by it, but in retrospect, like that's something I could like, me too this person for, right? So there's like things like that, but again, to really recover, like, again, that situation there was nothing forgotten there, they always remembered it. And so sometimes it can be, it's a subtle distinction, but these like hardcore, just like, relivings of something, I do sometimes wonder if that's just the drugs talking, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had one really kind of uncomfortable experience where when I was a child, I had this babysitter who was like kind of like a vagrant, weird guy, and he would like wrestle with me non-sexually, and I remember my parents walking in on him wrestling with me and being really, really horrified and saying like, that's it, like he's never alone with you again. This is totally unacceptable. And I felt insanely guilty as a child because I knew that they thought that he had done something bad and I knew that he hadn't done anything wrong. And I felt guilty for not defending him more vigorously and saying, it may have looked bad, but it really wasn't bad. There truly was no abuse. We truly were just wrestling. It wasn't bad. And I remember telling this story to an ex-girlfriend and she was like, you were molested. and I was like, no, I actually wasn't molested. That's the point of the story, is that I in fact was not molested, but there was an implication that I was, and I felt tremendously guilty for not defending this person. And she was like, you were molested. And I was like, no, I really was not molested. I truly 100% was not molested, like with absolute certainty. And she kept saying this to me, like, you're not like brave enough to admit that you were molested. And I was thinking, like, this is a real mind fuck, this sort of behavior. Like, if this were a therapist and the circumstances were a little bit different, I could imagine this really, I mean, it fucked with my head just sober with the conversation where I had to keep saying, no, I truly was not molested.
She just illusory truth affected you, you know? This is where, you know, where you keep repeating something and eventually it starts to ring true. And this actually relates to this whole Flux idea that, you know, I have, where I think psychedelics might enhance that effect. And so in addition to being able to, like, you know, produce these crazy visuals and, you know, visualization under the effects of these drugs can increase, you also, my thinking anyways, this is what we're going to be testing, is that processing fluency gets enhanced. So if you keep sitting there thinking about it over and over again, it becomes more easily processed over time. And what happens with greater processing fluency can come greater truthiness. Not something that's true, but that it feels more true. And so this is actually what the illusory truth effect is. If I show you a statement like, you know, twice versus it's the first time you're seeing it, you're gonna be more likely to rate it as true. And so I think psychedelics enhance that effect. And instead of having to see a statement, you know, 5, 10 times, you might only have to see it a couple times, and then you're gonna be more likely to, like, think it's true. So that is another factor here that I think it's like, okay, you conjure up some crazy visuals, and then maybe you are questioning it initially, but then you keep thinking about it under the effects of this drug, and then it just can really ramp up that fluency and make it feel like it's true. So I think there's like 2 factors that, like, psychedelics can enhance false memories, and we're actually, you know, we have 2 separate studies that are testing both of these things. And by the way, I will be the first one to admit I'm wrong if this doesn't happen. You know, there are alternative hypotheses that I, like, built into the grant, where one of them, it's, you know, we're going to be testing people's memories under the effects of psychedelics, you know, for things that they saw while they were sober. And are we going to see that people say they saw a bunch of things they never actually saw? And then the other one is we're going to have people encode a bunch of information, you know, form memories under the effects of psychedelics. And in this case, you know, we're going to show them a bunch of statements like, you know, honeybees have hair on their eyes, which is true, apparently. And then, you know, showing some statements, let's say once or twice, and then later on we'll have them evaluate those statements for the truthiness and then see, like, for example, typically you might need to see something twice to really start rating it as true, but maybe after only seeing it once, you very much rate it as true. But not that just everything feels true, but you have to have seen it already one time on a psychedelic and then evaluate it. Whereas the brand new stuff that you see, I sometimes even wonder if, like, that might even feel less true, you know? There's sometimes, like, things that where you're, you know, you are seeing something for the first time on a psychedelic. And so I had a friend talking about this where they saw, like, they were at a pool and they saw a lifesaver. You know, they're like, wait a minute, is that a word? Like, lifesaver? And so it's like, sometimes it's like, if anything, I think there's a questioning the first time you see something as psychedelic, but what happens with this almost like perceived novelty is greater information processing. You know, when you see things that are new, there's like more processing to that information, which can then result in greater processing fluency. And so it's kind of, that's like the idea that we're testing, this kind of like second part to how psychedelics can result in certain cognitive illusions. Yeah.
You're doing these experiments where you have this sort of confined, very structured way of studying memory, but then you have all of these more complicated social dimensions that emerge in therapy.
Right.
Like, there's a term, I imagine, for a patient wanting to please their therapist.
Oh, I don't know, but in at least experiments, we call it demand characteristics, where it's like, the participant finds out probably what the experiment's about, and then they try to, show that effect. Like, there's a lot of psychedelic studies that I think do this, where, for example, somebody, plays music on LSD versus placebo, and then they ask them, how emotional was the music? And every participant's going to be like, oh yeah, it was far more emotional on LSD. Like, there's really obvious studies like that where, and there's ways of controlling for those types of things, but you can look for a statistical interaction by playing different types of sounds and music, and then the participant doesn't really know exactly which one should be the most emotional. But yeah, people do these really lame studies sometimes with psychedelics that are very susceptible to demand characteristics. And I imagine that's a similar idea, with trying to please your therapist.
Or like, have you ever seen that Claudio Naranjo book, The Healing Journey?
No.
I haven't read it in years, but it's what I imagine a therapist's fantasy of psychedelic psychotherapy would be like. And presumably these stories are true, but every trip is some cathartic recognition of like, oh, I'm gay, like, and then like, like, so that there's like some kind of like, massive insight into the nature of their struggles, and as opposed to, months of avoiding whatever the issues are. And so I can imagine that there could even be some dynamic where you want to please the therapist, and now you're having this breakthrough, you're recovering a memory, how fascinating, this explains everything, and the therapist thinks, wow, I'm doing a really good job, I'm really helping this person access elements of their psyche that were previously inaccessible. This is working so well. And so I could imagine something like that happening. But just for the people that don't know, because I guess the current, as of today, New York Times reporting on the Amy Griffin story covers a lawsuit from a woman who is claiming that the abuses described by Amy Griffin were actually her, and that Amy Griffin had attempted to make a documentary about these abuses and like get her to sign a contract, and she had refused, and then took the story for herself.
Right. Yeah, I did see that. Yeah, I mean, I think I have no idea what's going on there, and I feel, I guess we'll find out, I obviously don't want to make comments and then it comes back and bites me in the ass, somebody sues me for something saying you didn't believe me. But at least as far as, what you're talking about with the therapist, I think this is a problem where, a therapist will tell people you might recover a memory, right? And I think we actually wrote a little critique. There was a paper that came out to patients there was like this open label anorexia study with psilocybin, and two of the patients claimed to remember something, and it was rather, I think both of the reports were rather nebulous. It was kind of like they couldn't see the face of the person, they don't know who it was, but they can remember like waking up and the next day and their pants were down or something. And so I'm not saying, by the way, that those people like got these people thinking that, oh yeah, these are real. But one of the things we sort of, they said in that paper was, maybe during preparation, we should, potentially warn people that they might recover memories. And so our critique of this was, well, that seems a little like uncritical, and we should instead maybe warn people that there's the possibility of recovering memories that don't exist. And as well as this like noetic quality, which what comes with processing fluency, as I was just saying, was essentially a noetic quality, thinking that this information, that it seems true. And that was kind of our take on it was, it almost certainly is true if you ask me, that psychedelics can produce false memories. People will claim to remember past lives. People will claim to remember things that happened to them prior to 3 years old. People will claim to be remember being abducted by aliens. At least there's enough cases of people creating these implausible events under the effects of psychedelics. And here's something pretty crazy. There's 2 papers on this, one in people who have claimed to be abducted by aliens, and another in people who claim to remember past lives. And just like simple lab-based false memory tasks, they'll score higher on.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like, so it's like, yeah, I mean, I think if anything, we should warn people that like what they remember might not necessarily be real. And again, look, I'll be the first to admit, if our study shows that people can actually remember better under the effects of a psychedelic, stuff that we objectively showed them, I'll eat my words, but that still doesn't change the fact that sometimes people remember things that didn't happen, you know, unless you believe in past lives or alien abductions. Like, you know, I don't think that it's the case that, I think it's very much the case that people have come up with things that certainly did not happen under the effects of these drugs.
Right. And I think it also is somewhat dependent on the value system of the person, where whenever I would do a Q&A on my podcast, I would get so many questions about people having shared hallucinations over and over and over again. And I think, why are people so interested in the concept of shared hallucinations? Why is this so valuable to people?
It does seem really cool if it were real.
It seems cool if it were real, because it basically shows that our material understanding of conscious experience has some missing piece that doesn't account for either telepathic type experiences.
It's quite magical, yeah.
Yeah, and so it has these major sort of potentially spiritual implications, and so I understand why people are drawn to that idea, but there's going to be a subset of people that very much want that to be true.
Totally.
It means something, it's important to them. In the same way that I notice that people are, in my appraisal, bizarrely emotional about the existence of aliens. Like, if you say publicly, I don't think there's strong evidence that there's extraterrestrial intelligence, and I think it's fully possible that even with the size of the universe, that we're it. That people don't like that. It's not just a statement. It says something more to them that is somehow spiritually or metaphysically disruptive. I mean, it's like you look at the Netflix Bob Lazar documentary, and that guy, Jeremy Corbell, who's making the documentary, is like breaking down in tears routinely. And you think, why is this dude crying about whether or not Bob Lazar reverse engineered an alien spacecraft? Like what? Like, but it's like clearly has some kind of emotional weight to it that is operating on some level that these issues don't matter to me.
I think it's people's like one last holdout on magic, you know? So for some people it's aliens, for some people it's psychedelics, you know? They maybe go through their life initially religious or something, and they're like, all right, this all seems like a sham. And then they're like, oh, but there's still potentially some, you know, spiritual, metaphysical, whatever in the world. And then, you know, every instance of something like, oh, I know somebody who can like predict the future, and it turns out, all right, they're scamming people. And it's like, all right, well, all these things might not be real, but you know what? Aliens, there's something there. Or, you know, psychedelics, they can help you access something that's, you know, out there in the world. And, you know, it's, yeah, I think, yeah, with aliens, you know, it's like, it's not good enough to just say, yeah, there could be some bacteria out there that, you know, somehow came together, and that's not good enough for them, right? They really want there to be like something extra. And I kind of get it, you know, magic is nice, but I don't know. It's like, learn to enjoy what you have here sometimes, you know, and you don't have to assume something extra. Like, I'd rather not do that.
Hello, my sweet little bee. I'm Hamilton Morris, your pharmacological advisor, and you can relax. Or can you? You're experiencing reckless caffeination. Tired eyes, jittery hands, nervous perspiration. Regular coffee will do that to you, but mud water with a fraction of the caffeine and 2,250 milligrams of functional mushrooms is leaving me calm, alert, and ready to help you. So put down the cup and pick up the phone. Dial 1-844-FIX-YOUR-FIX to break the cycle of reckless caffeination. Well, this is sort of what I wonder is, like, you're saying that the people who are abductees score higher in these false memory tests. I also wonder if people who are spiritually inclined who might actually like this idea. Like for me, I wouldn't like this idea. It would be a disruptive thing for me. If I recovered a memory of abuse, immediately I would be trying to talk myself out of it. I would be very skeptical of it. It would contradict my previous beliefs. It would not be something that I would be delighted by at all.
Yeah. I mean, there's something, it's interesting about fluency too, that it increases the truthiness. It also increases liking things more. So it's what's known as the mere exposure effect, right? Where you see something several times over and you're more likely to like it. Like one of my friends was just talking to me about this and he was like, I keep passing by this shitty graffiti in Baltimore and I think I started liking it. And I think that can happen too. You keep just repeating these things to yourself and you can start to like the ideas and these things and you want them to be real. But yeah, I don't know. It's like it's that holdout for magic. You want to know a little secret to my origin story? So I've got a few origin stories, from people killing themselves on drugs to, just wanting to connect my research to something more clinical, the memory stuff. But here was actually one thing that got me interested in psychedelics was, I had a friend who, she was quite spiritual and Christian, in fact, and in college, and she was saying that, when you're on, mushrooms, you really can see, you're seeing the same thing as somebody else, in the clouds. And I was like, really? Sure, if it actually resembles a dragon, maybe that some of the dragon features will get accentuated under the effects of a psychedelic, and that might make sense. But when somebody's seeing their grandmother in the clouds, and so, someone else is not seeing the same grandmother in the clouds, I find that to be, kind of absurd. And anytime with any of these cases where people will say that something magical happened, it just never gets reproduced. Show me a video of this, show me the situation in which somebody can actually see the same thing. And I actually had a really good question where somebody, I do think there could be some consistencies under the effects of these drugs with what people see. For example, color constancy, it breaks down. If I look at this white wall and, if I take a picture, take out individual pixels of, what's on this white wall and blow it up onto a white background. There's actually a bunch of colors, in that picture, right? There's gonna be blues and grays, and I'm doing this to try to block out the context, probably some yellows in there, et cetera. And that seems to maybe break down under the effects of psychedelics. And does that break down in a consistent way across people? Maybe, maybe under the right light, the purple start to pop out of this wall more for the same two of the same people. I think that would be a really cool way of showing that, hey, certain types of visuals might actually be consistent across people. But now when somebody gets into the really idiosyncratic, I'm seeing my grandmother, I don't think the other person's gonna see their grandmother in there, in the same way, because they don't know what this person's grandmother looks like. And that just seems, magical thinking to me.
And then it also starts to call into question potentially everything, because the ostensible purpose of using these things therapeutically is that you're gaining self-insight and that you're...
that's a crazy thing. Yeah, that would... It's you're getting someone else's insight. Yeah. What's kind of interesting about insights is, these insight moments, these aha moments, right? They're researchers will qualify them by 4 sort of qualities. And I don't know if I can remember them all, but one is positive affect. Another is the rapidity, how quick it happens. And then another is the fluency, the ease of information processing that seems to suddenly kind of happen. Oh, and then I think surprise might be the other one. And so, one idea that, we've been playing with, this idea of this Flux model for fluency exaggeration, is not just that it's the case that fluency gets ramped up, but that we really can drive an insight and learning in a system that's typically slow learning. So we think that this is happening in the cortex particularly. So you've got your hippocampus, which is a very fast learning system. It's forms your episodic memories. I walk into this room, I walk out, I already have a memory of many of the different things that are happening in this room kind of bound together. The smells, the red chair, the whatever, the people in the room, what they're wearing. But what's kind of interesting about those memories is that they also kind of fade very quickly. As soon as I leave, by tomorrow, I'm going to forget what color the chair was potentially. I'm going to forget what you were wearing, etc. But then you have the slower learning system in the cortex, and it's it's thought to resemble more semantic memories, so more like knowing certain piece of information, like George Washington is the first president of the country, or the serotonin 2A receptor is, at least heavily involved in the effects of psychedelics. And a lot of those pieces of information have been stripped away of all the self-relevant material. Like, I don't remember where I learned about the serotonin 2A receptor. I don't remember where I learned about George Washington being the first president, right? And one idea that we're saying is that you can accelerate learning into the cortex, so it comes with this sense of noeticism and just very hard truth. It's like George Washington, the first president of the country, I got abused as a kid, and it's those two things feel very true at the same, the same kind of level of truthiness, that even if I took out somebody's hippocampus, they might still have this insight from under the effects of a psychedelic. And normally it takes a lot of somebody without a hippocampus, like patient HM, I think he got his hippocampus out in 1959. So I think Eisenhower was president probably. I think over time he was able to learn that, the president changed, but it would take a lot more time. It was very slow learning, maybe multiple repetitions before, he could say, oh yeah, the president has now changed to Kennedy. Kennedy got shot and now it's, LBJ, et cetera. And so, yeah, we're kind of, it's like two hits. One is that just the initial truthiness can get ramped up, but then if you can accelerate this insight, it might really become this semi-permanent, stable semantic memory that essentially beliefs are semantic memories that not everybody shares. Serotonin 2A receptor is, the primary action of psychedelics. Jesus is the Son of God, same level of truthiness, right, that some people have. Those two things, it's both of those things are historical, or George Washington, first president of the country, Jesus, Son of God, that feels the same way to some people. And so, yeah, we kind of, that's another idea. We just applied for funding to try to test this, where we're going to be looking at essentially the stability of memories from a psychedelic experience. So even though less memories might get in to the system under the effects of a psychedelic, the ones that do get in might be really driven into the system and hard to kind of let go of. And so we can actually look at the memory representation over time and show that essentially it remains more static, that it changes less, and that's kind of a quality of a semantic memory.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it's I've seen these talks where ayahuasca shamans and things like that will make these sorts of claims, like the visions of ayahuasca are the real reality and that is the real truth, and I can sort of easily dismiss that within my own worldview and say, of course, sure, for them, why not? But for me, that's not the case. I'm very comfortable with the possibility that some vision that I have under the influence of DMT is the product of this pharmacological effect of a drug, and that it is not real and doesn't need to be real to be valuable, and that's all fine. But then there are other aspects of these experiences that do feel very real to me, in part because they are congruent with my worldview, where, yeah, so then if I have a thought about, hey, I should be nicer to people in general, that's a good thing to do. It's don't be a dick. It pays dividends to be nice. It's a better way to be. I suppose that has an equal chance of being hallucinatory, but I am not disinclined to believe it the way I would be if I had some vision of a MC Escher-ish geometric palace or something.
Yeah, I mean, so actually one thing about semantic memories, in at least under sober conditions and presumably under psychedelics as well, is that, I kind of said, oh, they're slow learning. It might take months to years to acquire a new semantic memory. So, for example, if you took out my hippocampus, I would assume my Spanish would still be there. I grew up partially in Texas, been taking Spanish from a young age. I lived in Spain. My wife's Argentinian. I think it would still be there. But I've been trying to learn French, just with Duolingo. And then I went to Geneva, in October. And I think if you took my hippocampus out, I don't think the French is going to stay in the system. Although I bet some of the things that would stay in the system would be the things that are similar to Spanish, where I can kind of bootstrap off of the Spanish. So that's actually something that under sober conditions, it is thought that you can drive semantic learning and change the system by, what's similar already. And there's these cases where you can get amnesics, like patients with hippocampal lesions, to learn information faster, but especially if it's something that's like similar enough that they can integrate already into their like pre-existing semantic network. And so, what you're saying, things that are like consistent, you see something consistent with something you already kind of have in your mind, well, yeah, that might be able to get driven into the system more easily. But, when it's something that's like extremely bizarre, like you try to get me to like believe in God or something like that, right? I think you might need some extra juice to like make that flow. And I think psychedelics could do that, where it's kind of scary. I don't think that it works for everything. But again, sometimes people are wanting to recover information. They're wanting to recover memories and become interesting, have an interesting story, etc. And then when they get that, it kind of is more easily driven. And I think a lot of people do believe this. I don't think that they're, just making shit up. It gets a little, yeah, that's kind of, I don't know. If it's consistent with what you're already going with, it's more easily, I think, driven into the system.
Yeah, I wonder how much of an issue this is in terms of the safety of psychedelics on a large scale therapeutically. Like, how is this the tip of an iceberg? Will this be a bigger deal with wider implementation of these substances? It doesn't appear to have been a problem with ketamine as far as I know.
So, this effect that we found, so the reason we started like pursuing this is because this temporary fluency, familiarity is what we found got enhanced. So we show people a bunch of words or pictures or words and pictures, and then we test their memory later. So we show them words and pictures while they're on psychedelics, and then we test their memory later when they're sober. And what we can show is that this hippocampal dependent memory seems to, almost certainly get impaired. So their ability to like really recollect and like, say, where and when they saw this picture and the list of, things that we showed them, et cetera, that's probably impaired. But the sense of knowing that they saw something seemed to get enhanced. And we can show this with like different computational models, certain types of memory errors. Their confidence, which a lot of times your confidence is going to be more varied if you're using more of this cortical familiarity process. And so familiarity is kind of this like sense of knowing without necessarily knowing why, like, oh, I know I've seen you before, but I can't remember where I met you, when I met you, what your name is, etc. And so that's what we've shown gets enhanced. And familiarity is essentially an attribution of processing fluency to your memory. But there's other cases where it's like, oh man, like I really like this person, or oh man, that statement, that's definitely true. And you don't relate it to your memory. It's not like, oh, I've seen this before. It just feels true. But maybe if it was on a memory test, you would then be like, oh, this is like, I've seen this before. So you can attribute processing fluency in a way that, is not always like, it produces these cognitive illusions. And, it's also not always the most accurate memory. Sometimes it can help you be like, I know I've met you before, and it turns out y'all actually have met. But there also might be a situation where you're like, I know I've met this guy before, and it's like, oh no, it's just some other Indian guy, that wears purple. Right? Yeah. So I think there's, that's kind of like our starting point, for this. And we did not find this with the NMDA antagonists. So dextromethorphan, high doses. So what was interesting with psilocybin was the effect got like even larger, like on familiarity, when we got up to 30 milligrams, where people are barely even functional to perform this like memory task, right? While they're like encoding the information, and then they're being tested later when they're largely sober. But then with like dextromethorphan, you start cranking up that dose, and I couldn't even analyze the data with like 700 milligrams because there was just no memory, and half the people dropped out because they couldn't even function. But at 400 milligrams, there was like, if anything, evidence that familiarity, so recollection of course was impaired, your hippocampal dependent memory, that really kind of standard way we think of episodic memory, definitely impaired. But then familiarity was starting to get impaired at these higher doses. The same thing with ketamine, where at the lower doses, familiarity was maybe spared, but definitely at the higher doses, you start to see this like impairment of, this processing fluency, cortical dependent memory. And so this is where I think that these drugs actually differ. Although, I don't know, there might be like dose dependencies where like, for example, that like, there's this whole idea at low doses of ketamine that it tends to hit more like inhibitory neurons, right? And so now you're inhibiting the inhibitors, and then that might actually result in like greater cortical processing potentially. And one reason actually, there's a very crude explanation for why we think psychedelics are doing this, the serotonergic psychedelics, is that the serotonin 2A receptor is largely expressed in the hippocampus on inhibitory neurons, whereas in the cortex, it might be more prominent on excitatory neurons. So, from a very just simple sort of point of view, all right, inhibition of the hippocampus, excitation of, the cortex, whereas high doses of ketamine, you're kind of just inhibiting the whole system. I mean, eventually people just get knocked out, right? So, yeah, that's kind of why we think there might be something unique with the classic psychedelics. But yeah, I mean, I think it's something like, this is where education's important, where again, I think we need to tell people that there's a noetic quality, and it's not necessarily true. I mean, just given that people will come out of these experiences with like, they'll be like, oh yeah, I understand the universe, or I, know the origins of life, and then they have no background in this, and it's like, no, you don't. Where's your Nobel Prize, bro?
This podcast is also brought to you by Lucy Nicotine, a company that makes nicotine pouches, nicotine gum, and nicotine lozenges. I particularly enjoy the apple ice flavored nicotine pouch. It is a refreshing and well-formulated product. If you don't already use nicotine products, I recommend you don't begin. They're habit forming. But if you do, I think this is the finest nicotine product on the market. Thank you, Lucy. And in case this isn't already obvious, warning, this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical.
And so, Bruce Damer, on the other hand, who has a kind of, I think like he's got a good scaffolding of the origins of life, right? And then he kind of just rearranged some information under the effects of psychedelics, perhaps processing fluency. One thing that it does is it can actually result in like the activation of more consciousness. Things are more easily running through the system. There's less like novelty to it. You might be more readily able to like, rather than fixate on one idea, you shift to another. And to then come up with like a novel solution, I think could totally be possible. Like, I do think that it's possible that these drugs for, certain people, certain types of information, like, they might be able to come up with new solutions. So I don't think, for example, I should be coming up with the origins of life because I don't know shit about, cellular biology. But for Bruce to come up with this, new idea where it's like, hey, instead of like, life starting at the bottom of the ocean in thermal vents, instead it starts in, these hot springs where it's still hot. There's still sometimes lava and whatnot. And there's a bunch of different chemicals, but you can get cycles of wet and dry, which is what we need in order to be able to produce, at least in the lab, to produce these like protocells. It's not like there's not like high salinity the way there is in the ocean, where that can potentially be like bad for the production of cells that don't have pumps to pump out that salinity. So I think that it could make sense that you can come up with certain insights, new sort of organization of information. But, when it's something just so bizarre, like someone who has no background in, physics, and they're like, I know, the origins of the universe or something. It's like, shut the fuck up.
Yeah, I want to talk with you about Bruce Damer because I saw him speak recently, but just briefly back to the ketamine versus, because the other kind of paradoxical thing about this is experientially, dissociatives, in my use of them at higher doses, tend to produce a proliferation of delusional ideas, extremely delusional ideas. I have believed that I was checking my email with my mind. I have believed that I was reliving evolution.
Under the acute effects.
Yes, actually the first time I ever used ketamine, I thought that I had mentally connected to the internet.
Wow, how long were you doing it?
Like, this is just from a single dose, a single dose, yeah. I thought I was.
Line?
It was probably 80 to 100 milligrams, something like that. But I thought I was online, and because the experience is so bizarre and disconnected to reality, there was not much of a sense that it might be true, or if it is true, it would be true in some kind of outlandish, I didn't come out of it and think like, oh, I got to get into this. Like, can I mentally connect? Is it possible to mentally connect to the internet? Like, it wasn't something that I ever took seriously. But then when you start to dial back the intensity of the hallucinations and the weirdness of the experience, it becomes that much more plausible. So MDMA, on the other hand, is a drug that rarely, if ever, produces hallucinations for people. And so if you remember something, you might be that much more inclined to think that it's actually real, because you don't have this kind of context of everything being completely chaotically strange.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like, yeah. And that's the thing too with these drugs, as you just said, with especially with, ketamine, dextromethorphan, et cetera, they really like knock out your memory pretty hard, forgetting the cortical versus hippocampal sort of thing. So when you come back out of it, you're like, I can't even remember exactly what it was that made me feel like that I was on the internet, but there was something there. But given that it's kind of vaguely in memory, it's sort of, yeah, it's harder to like, attach any like reality to that. But I mean, it does make me wonder. So like I've I sometimes wonder if there might be like, biphasic effects too, where, so I've heard of people coming out of like nitrous, which is probably largely due to NMDA antagonism. And, it's not necessarily right there when they're like, at the top of, the experience, but it's almost like when they're clicking back in, they'll be like, whoa, I have this like crazy sense of deja vu. Like everything that somebody says feels like they know that they're gonna, they know what they're about to say. Obviously they can't predict what they're about to say. And so like from that experience, it's almost like a retrieval of familiarity that gets enhanced. Like the thing that I'm saying with psychedelics is it's an encoding, so that what you form, the memories that you form, become more of this familiarity, fluency dependent, cortical dependent memory. Whereas over here, there's almost like a producing the illusion of familiarity, like for something that's brand new, for the first time you're seeing it. So if I showed you a bunch of things under the effects of, ketamine, it's going to feel very familiar. Whereas if I show you a bunch of things under the effects of a psychedelic, it might even feel quite novel, even if it is familiar. But then afterwards, it's going to feel familiar.
And the familiarity impacts the perceived
truthiness subsequently, yeah. That's like the whole thing. Familiarity breeds fondness, familiarity breeds truthiness. This whole fluency process is pretty tight. I think it's kind of evolutionarily, if you think about it, like beneficial for like social creatures. This is getting into very speculative evolutionary psychology, but like generally speaking, well, first of all, like processing things that are familiar, there's just less resources that are dedicated towards that. And so you can, process other things. You can dedicate those resources to things that might kill you in your environment. But, the same thing with like truthiness. We don't have time to evaluate absolutely everything that we hear. And so if you hear things enough within a society, it's probably the case that it's true, I don't know about right now. But it's, it seems to be the case, at least, prior to AI and all the fake news stuff.
Actually, that's a question. Is like, is there a way to quantify or study how much people care about things being true?
Almost like prior, how much they care, and then looking at if I show you a bunch of things that might be related to that thing, or what do you mean? Yeah.
Like this is, I think, the actual darkest implication of AI-associated disinformation and misinformation is, you've heard people say a million times, like, gee whiz, you don't even know what's real anymore. And I looked at this video and I thought it was real, and then I realized it was AI. And then I had this experience where I was looking at this Instagram reel, and it was a video of 3 parakeets sleeping inside the jowl of a French bulldog. And I showed it to a friend. She was like, that's clearly AI. And I was looking at it and I was thinking, I don't know. And I was looking at the account and it wasn't clear to me. And then at some point I thought, I don't actually care whether it's AI or not. But that was almost like the darkest thing of all, is not caring anymore. And then
I can't believe you wouldn't care about that. That bothers me. These fake animal things, the things that like compel me about animal videos is that the fact that animals do have this capacity to like do these things and that can exist out in the world. But to not, care, it's like, all right, well, just anything, it'll be cute. This is a cute video, let's just, see this. But yeah, I gotta wonder, do people care about, it's like when I watch a movie, obviously I don't care if it's true or not, right? Even then, I feel like sometimes people care. They're like, wait a minute, what parts of these, this based on a true story is actually true? But I'm sure there's ways to like quantify that, like how much, do you care? And maybe that's actually a good way of like quantifying it, is seeing people's like reactions to AI and being like, do you actually care or not that this happened? Or how much they're willing to now recapitulate that information that they saw. Because one difference there is you're probably now not going to tell people, hey, I saw this bulldog with, I know you just told me, that it was probably AI, right?
I actually think it was real, but I'm not sure. Well, and maybe I do care a little bit.
Yeah. Wait, I can't imagine that's real. Really? Parakeets in a bulldog's mouth?
It looked real to me.
Yeah, well, a lot of things look really real to me these days. I really care about this right now. Yeah.
But even from a professional perspective, there's certain professions where your reputation depends on your ability to assess truth. If you're a scientist or a journalist or in different domains, you have to have a good sense of what is true and what isn't true, or else you're untrustworthy, your work is unreliable. But that's not the case for everyone. There's a lot of people where their personality isn't hinged on assessing the truth of the claims that surround them. It's not that important to them. They don't need to have the ultimate in-depth understanding of like whatever issues, Epstein or lab leak or whatever. They can kind of just say, I don't know, I read this and I don't know if it's true. And so I also wonder if that impacts things, to what extent people actually care.
So, there's something, sometimes I see this, I feel like in the psychedelic world where it's like, I don't really care if that's a false memory or whether or not we really are, actually saw the same hallucination. We really are talking to each other telepathically. It's a nice thought, And there's, there was this one study where they were actually looking at people with who claimed to have ESP, and they wanted to show that false memory effect. But ESP is a little different, right? You're not necessarily having a false memory like an alien abduction or past lives. It's something else, right? And they didn't find that false memory effect. But what they did find on other tasks is, I think, analytical thinking was kind of reduced. It's pissed a lot of people off. And so, that might be one way to like assess, is looking at analytic thinking and whether or not that is, a factor in, how much people are also, susceptible to certain forms of bullshit. Yeah.
Because like even now, as I tell that story, I'm like, was it a parakeet? It may have actually been a different type of bird. and like, does that ruin my story if it was a different type of bird? But like, maybe for a lot of people, they just don't care about things like that. And I wonder if that plays a role in all of this.
Yeah, like I think some degree of not caring, and I think, and to some degree it doesn't really matter sometimes, these things. It is a nice thought to have that people can be connected and, they can see the same things, and that, they can recover information from past lives and why their, whole family has been traumatized, due to what their ancestors did or something like that. Whatever helps you get you through your day, but there are certain things where I think it can be problematic, right? When people are, with the Amy Griffin story, apparently people were able to identify that teacher.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah, and then I think from that new New York Times article, the woman who's now suing Amy Griffin was saying that it's actually not him, it's somebody else.
It's someone else.
Like, how much would it suck to be that guy, assuming it is not true? If it's really not true, that guy's life is so screwed right now. No one's gonna he goes and hangs out in the park and people are like, come on children, we gotta go, this really can have effects on people. Sure, you wanna, talk about past lives or whatever, your ancestors, and what they did. Generally speaking, it's not going to be too bad unless you're going to start pinning blame on certain types of people. But Yeah, I think it could get a little hectic, and more than just, I should say hectic. That's a, yeah. It could get bad. You can ruin people's lives with these things, right? And that's like, in that book, Remembering Satan, right? How many lives were ruined in the Satanic Panic from, there wasn't even drugs involved in that case, right? And so now you throw drugs on top of it, and yeah, you get a bunch of people that will sometimes gravitate towards these drugs that are, maybe I shouldn't say this, but gullible, or not analytic thinking sometimes, or just don't care about what's true. And sometimes people will be like, well, there is no truth. There's nothing we can ever really know. And I kind of know what people mean by that philosophically, right? That, there's always illusions in our, vision, or what we're thinking, or, what we're hearing. I was just talking about how this wall is not actually fully white, at least in my vision, the light that's coming off of it. It's like, well, we have to sometimes tether ourselves to what's generally true.
Absolutely. Yes, I would say completely. And I mean, this is something that more recently in the realm of conspiracy theories, I'm someone that used to love conspiracy theories and thought it was fun, and even thought that it was sort of educational.
Yeah.
So when someone would say, oh, we didn't land on the moon, or the earth is flat, I'd think, okay, well, isn't this a wonderful opportunity to prove that we did land on the moon, mm-hmm. and prove that the earth is round? And it is through this exercise that we can understand why we think what we think and why we know what we know. And this is actually pedagogically valuable and disguised as some kind of silly nonsense. But more recently, I have really changed my attitude toward conspiracy theories. And
they produce illusory truth effects. They can really start to make things seem true to people that don't think that way, where it's like, this is an exercise in critical thought. Instead, it just makes people just, without a question, be like, well, this is starting to sound really true. That being said, I will say, yeah, I'm the same way, that I've kind of gotten very sick of conspiracy theories, even though earlier on in life, I thought, oh man, 9/11 inside job, this guy Alex is pretty, he's really saying something that speaks to me, Alex Jones. And, now I've gotten very sick of it until the Epstein files.
Wow. Just got to the top of a 511B, not trying to brag. I think I did it with the help of this matcha-infused electrolyte beverage, Matcha Aid. Not something that immediately would sound appealing. I will admit, when I was first told about Matcha Aid, I thought the combination of matcha green tea and electrolytes sounded slightly disgusting. And then I drank a whole box. And then I drank another. Maybe you feel that we've reached peak matcha. Maybe you're tired of matcha. Maybe you think the matcha latte has gone too far. I personally, I'm okay with it. I think we can go deeper. And now I'm a convert. I'm a big fan of Matcha Aid, as strange as it may sound. I would demonstrate by pouring it at the top of this wall, but I'm afraid that I would drop a bottle and give somebody a traumatic brain injury. Matcha.com was created by psychedelic pioneer Dr. Andrew Weil. They are a premier source of Japanese imported, heavy metal tested, delicious matcha. I use it when I'm climbing. I use it when I'm doing sporty things. I use it when I'm dangling 45 feet off the ground doing a podcast advertisement, offering you a discount code if you use Hamilton at matcha.com. 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 But that's the thing about conspiracies, is I started to think that the conspiracy theorists are inadvertent participants in a grand conspiracy, which is to disable people's critical thinking skills. And you actually see this so beautifully with Epstein, where it's like, here, you've got a real honest to goodness conspiracy right here.
Yeah.
And then I see all these people saying it's because don't you realize they're talking about alchemy throughout this interview. It's the alchemists and the Freemasons.
And the pizza.
And the pizza one is actually, because there actually are a lot of mentions of pizza in the...
I know, that is, but do you think it was happening at the basement of that?
No, I don't. And
heck, that ruined probably sales at that pizza place,
The guy came in and shot.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah. It had, that's the other thing, is that analogously to the teacher who may have been falsely accused, there are real people in these conspiracies whose lives are impacted. Like a popular one is, there was this book Chaos. This guy, Tom O'Neill, had this hypothesis that Charles Manson was brainwashed by the CIA to then brainwash the Manson family to kill Sharon Tate. And you could say, okay, maybe that's not so wonderful for Roman Polanski or Sharon Tate's living relatives or whatever, but like, you know, people have reduced sympathy for celebrities in general in these sorts of domains. But the hinge of his conspiracy theory involved a physician in Haight-Ashbury at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, David E. Smith. And this is a real man who's now being implicated in the brainwashing of Charles Manson, and he almost certainly was not involved. And you start to think like, you know, this is like, this guy's got family, this guy's getting emails from crazy people, almost certainly. Like this is gonna have a real effect on his life. Same thing with Alex Jones and Sandy Hook being a false flag. It's like you have grieving parents who are being told that they were crisis actors as they mourn the death of their children. Like a lot of this stuff, yes, it has impact on real living people, but it also interferes with people's ability to correctly interpret real conspiracies like what was happening with Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're completely right, where it's like, you know, we went from discrediting, you know, a patient with schizophrenia to now, you know, Charles Manson, right, which is more than likely where some of that came from. I think he had schizophrenia, right?
He did, yes.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting too that we generally do discredit, you know, patients with schizophrenia and the delusions that they have and when they're talking, you know, telepathically with other people. But then for some reason with psychedelics, we like give them like, oh no, but that's real, you know? The things that happen under psychedelics real, but not that patient over there. He's got problems, you know? But now it's starting to like, we're like, you know, well, even people with schizophrenia can potentially be, you know, and don't get me wrong, I do think that there are cases in which somebody can be schizophrenic and also be telling the truth. There was actually I don't know if I should name names here, although I think all the information's out there, but there's a doctor I know, a psychiatrist, and there was this patient that he had that kept saying, oh, they're like trying to poison me. There's like, you know, my husband's trying to poison me and putting arsenic, you know, and this patient I think did have schizophrenia. And then as it turns out, I think they eventually did like look at her blood and she had arsenic in her blood. And they ended up finding out that the husband's previous wife died of mysterious causes. And it's like something like that could really, you know, compel you to start thinking, well, maybe we should sometimes believe, you know, yeah, patients with schizophrenia. And I don't think that, you know, we should completely discredit everything. But obviously some of the more bizarre things, right, that are impossible, or if not impossible, highly improbable, right? I think, you know, sometimes, yeah, we just start to like, you let one thing in and then it lets many other things, you know, in. Yeah, I think that's exactly what conspiracy theories are doing. What this Epstein thing is doing, it's gonna go from, I mean, it is a pretty big, sounds like a pretty big conspiracy, you know, like that seems real, like a lot of it. But yeah, was there, you know, a, you know, pizza chain that like, or pizza place that like had people in the basement and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton would go there or something like that? Just, it's like, all right, we're getting a little, you know, an island makes sense, you know, but now you're talking about some place in the middle of DC. Like sometimes I think people just like forget, it's like, okay, before we jump to the next thing, like what do we even have that's solid here?
And then you're wasting time that could be spent actually looking at what was going on. Like I tweeted this drug list. Oh yeah. And I actually strongly suspect I know exactly where this drug list was from, which was a really high-end New York City drug dealer, which would make total sense. And it's not crazy that someone like Epstein would be connected to a high-end New York City celebrity drug dealer. But everyone started saying, oh, like the drug menu on the island. It's like, there's no evidence that this is connected to the island. This menu is totally decontextualized. The most likely explanation is that this is something that was sent to him by a drug dealer.
And I think that actually, like in that situation, it's good. Again, we should, I think, always question, and I always tell people this in classes, because a lot of times like tear apart a lot of psychedelic research that's like based on very poor data or poor interpretations of data. And then I'll always tell people like, and then I'll go over my research and I'll be like, just so you know, you should also question what I'm telling you, where this is why we're explicitly testing this. And I think that kind of questioning is not bad because, for example, apparently Epstein didn't really do drugs.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah.
There's very little in the files.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like, I think that people said he didn't even drink or something like that. Yeah. So, it's kind of, we should be questioning these things to some degree. Of course, if you can keep finding evidence that, hey, it also makes sense that would he know a drug dealer, as you said? Probably. He lives in New York City. And then on top of that, wouldn't somebody want drugs, especially when they're having like a sex party or something like that? Potentially, So it also seems very likely, but it's worth questioning these things, like even what's coming out with like, the Epstein files and like, I don't want to get like political here, but it's like, yeah, there's some, implications, with Trump and whatnot, but like, has there been a really hardcore thing that made you think Trump was definitely involved with, could he have been involved with a sex worker? Potentially, right? I think there's some there's some cases on that, right? Have you seen anything yet that really shows that he was involved with somebody like underage?
Yes, but
yes.
Yes,
okay.
But
I also haven't been paying attention super close to the Epstein files. I don't want to say I'm denying this either. Yeah,
but there is a file of unsubstantiated reports that were sent to the FBI. So there are reports. There's someone, I believe she was 15, who claimed.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think I did see that. But it's like, unfortunately, it's like, okay, is that hard evidence yet?
It's not hard evidence.
Right. Versus like, what happened with Epstein, it was like, oh yeah, there's some hard evidence here that he's been, getting massages from very underage people, right? It's like, that hasn't quite come out yet. And so like, I kind of, I hate to say it, where I'm like, did he know things were happening? That seems likely if you're really good friends with somebody. Has he ever potentially, cheated on his wife?
Certainly.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like all the data point towards that. But are we really going to get hard evidence from the Epstein files? I'm not sure about that. Yeah.
In terms of a direct admission or photographic evidence, if it even existed and would truly be released in the current administration.
Formerly known as Prince Andrew, there's that picture, right, with Virginia, whatever, right?
Frey.
Yeah, is that how you pronounce that? It's one of those things I always like read and I never actually think how it's pronounced. But yeah, that seems, that's pretty damning, right? Much more damning anyways than a lot of the other things that we've seen. And on top of that, with the whole royal family just like disowning him, it seems pretty messed up, right? But yeah, I don't know. I do, yeah, obviously I do think that something weird was going on, but it's hard for me to say, is there any damning evidence yet? And I think it's good to still have a degree of like skepticism, where obviously some really fucked up shit happened, in the Epstein files, and loads of people are implicated in it. But sometimes I think we need to also be a little like, yeah, exactly. Like, unfortunately, with a lot of these things, we might need some hard evidence, or else that might also lead to a bunch of people being accused of things that, aren't necessarily like, yeah, they took money from Epstein, but were they, sleeping with raping underage people? Like, I don't know, not all of them were, right?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I've seen plenty of instances of people being unfairly blamed. This has obviously had some implications in the psychedelic world where, like, for example, did you know this guy, Ken, I'm forgetting his last name. He ran the Alchemist Kitchen and Evolver. He was directly communicating with Epstein, and I asked about it a bit. I contacted some people, he's dead now, and asked some people, did Ken know anything? And everyone said they had no reason to believe that he truly knew anything. And then people say, oh, but the allegations had been public since 2008 or whenever the conviction in Florida was. But the reality is that the story was so obscure until recently. Like I found a clip of Alex Jones on Joe Rogan in 2017, and he barely knows who Epstein is. Alex Jones is like, he's like, you know about he's like, you know about Jerry Epstein? and Joe Rogan's like, no, who's Jerry Epstein? He's like, oh, Jerry Epstein, yeah, he's, you know, he's one of the elites, and, you know, he's been up to all kinds of stuff.
Listen, we all know about Jerry Epstein, okay? And
I don't know about Jerry Epstein.
That was the Lolita Express. Just Google that. And
what is that?
Bill Clinton was like on 20 flights. First it was 7.
Oh, that's right. Okay,
To this
now
pedophile
I know who you're
island that
talking
has
about.
a temple in it.
Alex Jones clearly only has even a skeletal idea in 2017.
Damn, he got one right though.
He's gotten a few things right.
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah, 9/11, yeah.
He's
That's in the Epstein files.
So it's like, yeah, you have to balance this critical approach, because if you're not critical, then the real things that emerge can get swept up with all of the nonsense where, you know, did Ken know about any of this stuff? I kind of doubt it.
I mean, and it's like, you know, again, like there's something, you know, I mean, how many people have I heard of who've like been with a sex worker or seen that, you know, there's like people with sex workers and hopefully nothing bad is going on there. Like that honestly wouldn't surprise me that it's like, oh yeah, Jeffrey Epstein like allowed people to like, gave them a space to cheat on their wives. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be, I mean, that's illegal, I guess, but it's not like, you know, pedophilia, right? And could that have been a thing for a lot of people who were hanging out with him? Like, I'm sure that that's probably what they thought was going on. Because as you said, yeah, I didn't know anything. I like feel like I don't think I learned anything about, definitely not in 2008 did I even hear about, you know, the case of Jeffrey Epstein. And until really it came out, like, you know, when he was imprisoned, I think that was the first time I really started reading about it. You're right, it was kind of like this like nebulous area. And of course, you know, if I was taking money from him, would I like look him up? And, you know, could I also like, and it's not good, could I like justify to myself, it's like, well, I could really use this like $2 million for funding. And like, you know what, that happened 10 years ago. You know, maybe he didn't know, which like, I don't know, I think they were quite young, right? The things that went on there, yeah.
In the 2008, well, you can actually, there's plenty of clips of Alan Dershowitz giving the exact talking points that you know they used in the people. So I also imagine that he, you know, buried the search results so that it wasn't, you could probably find it if you knew to look, but you might not even find it in the Google search at that point. And Alan Dershowitz already had a whole explanation prepared, which was like, he's a very, very rich man. He parties in Florida. He made a stupid mistake. He, you know, slept with a 17-year-old girl a couple months before her 18th birthday.
The predecessor on your show described Jeffrey Epstein as a convicted pedophile. He pleaded guilty to one count of having sex for money with a 17-year and 10-month-old person. That's not pedophile.
And see, that would be something where I'd be like, okay, that's not good. Don't get me wrong, it's not good. Also 17, I think in Texas might be. That's like, in that state, I think that that's the age of consent or something.
Oh, I think it's even lower in some states.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, this isn't good. I've always found it weird when, you know, people in general sleep with really young people. Like that was the thing, I think I saw like the Science of Consciousness conference. Did they not cancel it or something this year? Because somebody who was involved, I hope this isn't fake news and AI generated this. You know, my Facebook definitely has some AI on it where I've been like, I've had to like be like, oh my God, Snoop Dogg was involved with Epstein, what, you know?
Right.
But I think that I saw something, and I want to say I Googled it, that somebody like took money, I think, for the Science of Consciousness conference or something like that. And that now, you know, they're stepping down and canceling it this year or something along those lines. And it's not good. You know, you should look up the people you take money from. But like, I don't know, I guess everybody that I've, like every time I've received private funding, did I really Google them? I mean, I think I Googled, you know, Bruce and his organization. I think I did that, and I mean, nothing came up on the first page, right? More than anything, I was more just interested in like what they were like interested in, right? And I didn't even think about like Googling like, oh, you know, does he have like a troubled past or something like that? Like that didn't even cross my mind. And so, I mean, as much as like, you know, not as much as there's people who are mentioned in the Epstein files that I think are like, it wasn't good that they took that money, you know, but there's a side of it where it's like, okay, I don't think they knew about, necessarily the pedophilia and whatnot. And, we have to, I think, be a little bit critical about these things and really find like the actual people, the real like, terrible people in there, and sift through, who's terrible versus who like was, could have done better in their Google search,
Right. It's because then it becomes a distraction if you think that Beyonce or Jay-Z, or maybe they were, I don't know, but like I see all this stuff of like they're in hiding, and it's like, I doubt that Jay-Z was like...
They're always in hiding. You ever seen them in town?
Yeah, it's and then the other thing is it speaks to the desperation of people in certain industries like psychedelic research or filmmaking, where you have people that desperately want to do things, research, make movies, whatever, and they're disinclined to look too carefully because they want to be able to do something. And here's some guy who's saying, oh, I'm a billionaire and I love science. And, oh, you're doing work on memory? I love memory.
Dude,
fantastic.
If like I had been in the position that I'm in now, and back in like 2013, let's say, and honestly back then, was it as much of a thing to Google somebody before you like meet them? Like I think in 2013 I met you. I vaguely knew who you were because of like the whatever was on Vice News, whatever. I'd never Googled you. I didn't know that your dad is some documentarian, anything like that, right? And so it's like we weren't even doing that back then as much.
It was a very different cultural climate.
Yeah, I do wonder I think again, the conspiracies are another kind of like way of like, it gives people like almost like, the feeling of insight, this like fluency and this positive affect where it's like, oh, I figured something and I connected the dots. There's something that, people get out of this that is, it's like seeking of information can be pleasurable in itself, that humans, I think, have evolved. And, it's another maybe way of like, there's just, holding out for magic in the world that, it's maybe quite not as magic, but it's more like there are these big things happening and I'm, privy to this information that like people really want to be true sometimes. And again, I use this as an example where holy shit, now I am a little bit like more on the conspiracy end, but I have to catch myself where I'm like, okay, I really do need to see some like real data. Like there's many things I can say that many people who are mentioned the Epstein files are fucking terrible people, but sometimes where it's like, okay, were they like actually like committing pedophilia? Did they know that pedophilia was happening? Where it's like, all right, there's gonna be people who we're probably gonna miss by being this critical, but I don't know, the potential for a false alarm, like do we really want to like ruin someone's life for like taking money only? Like, I don't know, maybe they should step down, but I don't think we should like demonize somebody for simply taking money when they didn't know the whole story, right? But yeah.
No one could have. To this, I even remember when he killed himself, there were all these memes about how he was killed.
Oh, dude, that's the one where I'm like, I don't know, dude.
Well, I
went from all these people making memes, and so he didn't kill himself. I thought it was hilarious, by the way, because it'd be like one of those memes where it's like, roses are red, violets are blue, Epstein didn't kill himself.
Yeah.
That's hilarious,
Yeah.
But
I thought, of course he killed himself.
Yeah.
He's a billionaire who has just been charged with one of the most reprehensible imaginable crimes. His lifestyle is over. He has nothing to live for anymore. Why wouldn't he kill himself?
He's not a religious person, almost certainly, and he's never going to get, laid by, people again, or he's never going to rape kids again. Let me just say it as it is, right? He is going to, why wouldn't he kill himself, right?
Yeah, what does he have to live for?
Yeah.
So when everyone is saying, oh, he was killed, I'd think, I don't know, maybe, but I don't think so. And then now it's like, I don't know anything anymore.
Dude, yeah, that's one where I really don't know. So, back to the psychedelics, things that I don't know anymore. Have you tried the DMT and the laser?
But I haven't, but people, again, like the shared hallucination thing, which this is a version of, people are totally fast. I've had people come up to me on the street about this that are like, what are your thoughts? Is it real? And what bothers me is not even the claim, it's that people are not devising an experiment to formally test it, which would be a little bit difficult, but I think it's possible to say, okay, so you're all seeing like a matrix code of reality with some kind of characters that are unfamiliar. Is there someone that could do this experiment who is skilled enough at drawing that they could draw these characters? And is there a linguist, or can you get two people to see if the characters are actually similar?
I think, I mean, honestly, I feel like most people could make something just because it looks like a shitty, something. You could be like, okay, those two things do look similar enough. There's a hexagon, a hexagon with spikes coming out of it or something, right? It's like, that should be easy enough to do without even needing a person to draw, and I would believe that, if two people drew a hexagon with spikes coming out, I'd be like, that seems pretty similar to me. And what's kind of cool about, in general, about like visual perception research is, unlike something like memory, where it's like we really have to test these things sometimes, with a lot of like visual perception, like illusions and whatnot research, you sometimes don't need like a large sample. Like, of course you need the formal experiment to say that, yes, this actually happened, but like, you can do it yourself as an experimenter and be like, wow, this works. I saw an explanation for, unfortunately, you probably know more about this than I do, in terms of like lasers and why they're special compared to normal light. They're not like, it's just kind of constant or something. I can't remember, but somebody had an explanation that there might be like actually getting a better sort of glimpse into like what's actually composing that laser. And which would be crazy, because then it would tell me that, hey, there's something that becomes, people like to say under psychedelics, oh, like things became sharper. And I'm like, really? Because a lot of people also report blurred vision, And okay, there are certain things that actually do become sharper. Like that would actually be really cool. But there's also so many people that have taken, and it would also tell me that DMT is special, because I was going to say a lot of people probably don't take DMT out in a club where there are lasers flashing around. But they do take psilocybin, they do take LSD, there's other psychedelics. Maybe they take pharmawaska, I don't know. But yeah, there's something that it's like, if this actually were real, it would be really cool, But I also, I don't know, I bought a laser recently, and I need to find my friends that do some DMT, and it was for my cat. But, I thought that maybe like, I've got some friends in Austin that they'll hit the pen sometimes, and maybe that's not a high enough dose, but.
Yeah, I mean, these things are testable, and that's the question, is like, if you could then motivate people to take that next step and actually evaluate these things, which has been done with lucid dreaming, and experiments were devised that were very convincing.
Ken Paller, Ken Paller at Northwestern. He's actually a memory researcher. Like, he's now, he's gotten more into the sleep stuff, but he was showing, for example, that like, you can show people stimuli in different locations on like a grid, let's say. Frog over here and you get a ribbit, you get a cow over here and you get a moo. If you play the ribbit during sleep, people are more able to like remember the location of where the frog was, versus if you don't play the moo during sleep and then look for the cow. So,
whoa.
Yeah, it's called targeted memory reactivation. And at this point, people have shown it, like, there's people in Germany doing this. There are some studies that don't quite replicate, but I think overall, like, the effect's probably relatively small, but people have shown this time and time again that you can like play sounds that were associated with certain things during what you were seeing, and the subset of things that you play the sound for, their memory will be better. So for the things that were associated with the things that you saw. So yeah, you play the ribbit, you'll remember the location better than if the cow, because you didn't play the moo.
Wow.
Yeah. And so like there's very controlled experiments for something like that people have done. Yeah, Ken Paller's doing great work. Yeah. Yeah,
and then with the laser thing, you might not be seeing the matrix code of reality, but maybe this is actually evidence of some interesting change in visual perception that hasn't previously been studied or characterized, that is based in the material world, that's useful.
Exactly. You're getting some either a sharper vision of like the laser, or whatever like, algorithms are being distorted in your, let's say, visual cortex under the effects of a psychedelic. They're doing it in a very consistent way across people. I think that it's kind of crazy actually sometimes that like with, visual perceptions, the like, thing that I think most obviously people get a lot of times, most people with psychedelics get, and that something people can understand too that have never taken psychedelics, it's like, oh, you see these patterns, whatever, And yet we're not really studying that. And I think part of it is like, well, where's the like therapeutic benefit to this, right? This is kind of like one reason why I was like glad that I got into like memory research, where, you know, I can say that, hey, by disrupting these, like, by having new learning in an otherwise slow learning memory system, we might be able to disrupt maladaptive beliefs, you know, displace them with like adaptive beliefs. Whereas like, hey, we understand like what weird set of distortions psychedelics are, you know, producing on your visual cortex. Like, where does that get us sometimes, you know? But I do think it's worth understanding. Like, sometimes you never know what basic finding is gonna lead to, you know, the next breakthrough. And there's like now one really good visual perception researcher that did do a study with psilocybin in Amsterdam, Marco Achille. I think he's from Italy, but he's doing his, or he did his PhD there. He actually showed, like, have you seen the Ebbinghaus illusion? So it's like you get two circles that are actually the same size, and then you put big circles around one, you put small circles around this one, and then you're gonna see the one that has the small circles around it as being larger. I could have gotten that wrong. It's a very, you know, obvious illusion. You can just, you know, Google it. And I think he showed recently, if I remember correctly, it's in Nature Communications, that I think the illusion got larger under the effects of psilocybin. And then he goes into like, they did fMRI and tried to go into some of like the neural computations involved in that. And it seems like, you know, it's like that's the type of work that I think would be really useful. And I mean, if you think about it, that's like early stage of information processing, like these low-level perceptual effects that in theory project to higher levels in a certain way that could then, for example, maybe go well with what I'm talking about, where it's like, okay, how do we get better drive cortical learning that can disrupt and target very specific like maladaptive memories? Somebody who's, you know, I was talking about how, you know, there's different types of beliefs, and we've been talking about it in a non-therapeutic fashion, but like we're talking about it kind of in a, what can go wrong, right? But I think what can go right is, for example, like somebody who, you know, has had depression for like, you know, 10 years. To them, George Washington, first president of the country, I'm a shitty human being. Like those two things feel the exact same truth, no matter how much evidence you provide to them that, you know, they're a family person, they volunteer, they, you know, give their money away, whatever. They don't feel that way, right? It doesn't feel true. It's like if somebody were like, when they told me Pluto wasn't a planet, it took years for me to accept that as truth, right? Like, you know, if you were to take my hippocampus out, I'd be like, there's still 8 planets. Is that right? Whatever, 9, whatever. Pluto's still a planet is the point, you know? And maybe now, I mean, you know what, you take my hippocampus out, I might still think, you know, Pluto's a planet in the solar system, right? And so it doesn't ring true. I need to take psychedelics to make Pluto untrue, you know, as a planet. And likewise, I think some people could like learn while under the effects of psychedelics that, hey, make it ring true that I am a good person, to kind of displace this maladaptive like memory, like I'm a terrible human being, or the world's a dangerous place, or whatever. That's kind of, I think, yeah, maybe that's a positive note. Yeah. Other than the false beliefs, I think that there are good things we can do in it. And it makes me think sometimes that, like, should we just be laying people on a couch with eye shades on? Or should we be like, I don't know, occasionally kind of like driving the fluency of certain types of ideas that, like, it sounds a little like brainwashy, but like, you know, I mean, telling people they're probably a good person is not a bad thing, you know, if they don't have good self-worth. I mean, I think some people probably should know they're a shitty person. But then, you know, maybe you need to like drive like, hey, maybe you should like, you know, look after your kids better, you know, drive that home to them. And I don't know who's the person to say that to them, but, you know, I mean, maybe somebody will come in and be like, you know, I know I'm a shitty parent, and you know, it's hard for me to give a shit about this, and like this makes me very depressed, but I really don't care about my kids, you know? It's like, okay, well, I'm gonna try to make that, you know, I'm gonna try to displace that, you know, idea in your head. And like, you let people know that potentially and be like, I want it to ring true that you love your kids and you're gonna take care of them. Like, I think we could, in theory, do things like that under the effects of psychedelics. And maybe a more kind of basic sort of point of view would be, a more basic like use would be like exposure therapy, where one issue with exposure therapy is like, you know, you have people reimagine this thing over and over and over again. That was terrible. And it starts to be like less harmful in their head anyways. But as soon as they leave this room where they did exposure therapy, they're now, you know, they get the wrong cue. You know, they see sand at the beach, they think sand at the desert, you know, war, beheaded child, etc. You know, go back to a flashback. So one issue with like exposure therapy is like, it doesn't make things very generalizable. and it's probably not written, this what's thought to be extinction learning it's not as strong as the original like fear memory. But maybe under the effects of a psychedelic, not only are you driving this into a more like, semi-permanent like memory system, and you're potentially, giving an illusory truth effect where it's like, hey, this thing's not going to harm you. You're giving them a mere exposure effect where maybe they don't like these things, these cues, but they dislike it less. But another interesting factor is if you're kind of shutting down the hippocampus, I shouldn't say shutting down, but you're inhibiting its function to some degree. The hippocampus is involved, as I mentioned, in like binding a bunch of elements together into a single contextual frame. You're kind of taking that out of the picture, and you can create this more context general sort of memory so that when they leave, their doctor's office after doing exposure therapy, they might have a more kind of like, context independent, generalized, feeling of not having to be afraid of, the cues that are typically giving them distress. And so, I don't know, I sometimes do wonder where it's like just the inner healer thing and like laying people on a couch with eye shades on, like, is that really the best way to be using these drugs, or could we be doing certain like manipulations with consent?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it could be done. It will be
optimized,
met with all kinds of opposition. I mean, I think John C. Lilly was doing a bit of that with ketamine in metaprogramming the human biocomputer. I think there was a lot of this kind of self-directed, intentional, consensual brainwashing at play, which is arguably one of the reasons that people do therapy. They wouldn't put it in those terms, but most people are hoping to change the way that they think about themselves in the world in such a way that they have a more positive self-image, and
it becomes like more natural and like readily accessible. Like that's the kind of thing with like a lot of semantic memories, is that they are more kind of just like, it's like just knowledge. It's readily accessible information. Whereas, that doesn't always make it into the system when you're trying to like learn things with just therapy, where it takes years sometimes, right? Months or years for things to start ringing true. And obviously I think the problem here is that if you really are accelerating a slow learning memory system into a faster one, I mean, there's also room for a lot of error, right? You might get the wrong thing into the system that could be very disruptive. And in fact, there was a study in rodents where I forget what they used, but they essentially artificially enhanced plasticity. It was probably some type of, using some type of like viral injection to like increase plasticity in the cortex. And what they found is in these rodents where you can get like a semantic like memory by creating a memory that becomes more of like a schematic rather than an accurate like where and when type memory, and it becomes cortical independent, that by accelerating plasticity in the cortex, it actually led to more forgetting of like other sorts of pieces of information, where it's like, okay, that could be both a good and bad thing. And maybe this is why we have one fast learning memory system, one slower learning memory system. So, I mean, I think that all these things could be, good and bad. And I think this is where the basic research comes in, where we try to figure out what are the parameters to like drive certain things into the system without like fucking everything else up,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I also wanted to talk with you about the insight research. I don't think you've published anything on that yet, have you?
No, we haven't. Yeah, that's part of that ongoing project. Essentially, yeah, it's related to the fluency stuff. And so that's exactly, because one idea is, it's kind of getting at is by enhancing processing fluency on the one end of things, I was kind of getting at is you can get things that feel insightful and get driven into this, semi-permanent memory system. But you also might actually be able to kind of activate through your semantic space more readily, and maybe create links that weren't already there that can then result in like a novel actual solution to something. That's kind of so there's been research from like with semantic priming where from the 90s, and this was shown twice, although both of the studies had like 10 subjects in them. But what they found was that under the effects of psilocybin, so normally if I give you the word sweet, you'll think sour. If you think sour, you think lemon. Over here under psilocybin, they were able to show that I give you sweet and you jump to the concept lemon. You're more like readily able to like skip a step and make it to that next, concept very quickly based on reaction times. And so that's something that, if you're you might be more likely able to find, novel solutions in a space that you already know. I don't think this is like, again, somebody being able to come up with like something, they might feel like they come up with, a solution to the origins of the universe, but I can't believe that they're true. And Bruce, by the way, he said, he's like, okay, comes up with this idea, but then he had like, he questioned it, and he got all of his like friends to like reality check him and wanted to make sure that, this isn't just crazy and that it feels true, but it's not, and then now he's like testing some of these things. So, because we're scientists, just because we have an idea and it makes sense, if, we were certain about everything, we wouldn't be running the experiments in the first place, right? And just to be clear, I think I've been thinking about this idea of like, flux and fluency and how it leads to, an illusion of truth and driving, stuff into semantic memory. Some of these ideas are potentially wrong, but they feel really true to me these days. I keep talking about that. I have to check myself on that.
Yeah, because I gave this talk at a conference about insight where Bruce Dahmer was speaking, and they showed this video of you talking about your recent research, and my talk was kind of dedicated to attempting to interpret this with a more skeptical view, because I was concerned by how much emphasis people were putting on these grandiose discoveries, these aha moments, and what I believe is that many of the most notable instances of these discoveries, like the one that people were giving was Kekulé kind of intuiting the structure of benzene in a dream. And like the really ironic thing about that story is that there was another researcher whose name is like totally forgotten by history, and I'm forgetting his name now, who actually did that. He actually did seemingly intuit the structure of benzene before Kekulé, but he didn't have evidence for it. And so no one really cared. And the reason people cared about Kekulé is that he was actually skeptically analyzing his work and basing it on evidence. And so people remember him as like this guy that intuited this amazing discovery, when the real person that did that nobody cared about, because that's not the way real discoveries are made. Same thing with Kerry Mullis and PCR, because he did use LSD and make LSD and did absolutely value psychedelics, and he told Albert Hoffman that LSD was instrumental in his work or something like that. People then take that to the next step and they say, oh, he discovered PCR while he was on LSD. This is like kind of why I've probably said this before, but in his own writing about it, he was drunk driving when he was drunk driving, and then went to a cabin and then kind of had this discovery and continued drinking. So if there was any drug associated with the insight, it was alcohol.
Oh, dude, that's so funny, because there's the remote associates task. So I give you the words, let me think. Okay, if I give you the words knee, table, and journey, what's a word that puts those three things somehow together?
Knee, table, journey, foot?
No, but that's really close.
Knee, table, journey.
Leg.
Leg, okay.
Leg of a journey, leg of a table.
Oh, okay.
Leg of my knee, right?
Okay.
And so people have done that study with people on alcohol. I think there's been 2 studies that actually found there was an enhancement. I think one that found no effect. But they found that on the remote associates task that people got better. They call it like creativity on tap, I think, isn't the name of one of those papers. And it's like, well, there might be a loosening under certain doses of alcohol of like concepts there as well that more readily flow. We actually are looking at this at Hopkins. In fact, I think the data collection is finished in that. And a little preview, I don't think people got better under the effects of psilocybin on that task. It hasn't been analyzed yet, but we also looked at people, like how much when they did come up with an idea, did they like have a feeling of insight? Did that maybe like get enhanced under the effects of psychedelics, just the feeling of insight? Which I think it's probably wasn't changed too much. I think that whole task was just a bust. But it's like, alcohol might do that for people sometimes. I mean, I know people who've been like stoned in the shower and they came up with like experiments that, they did. I think just being in different states and sometimes thinking of things in a slightly different way can be useful. You know, you might slightly activate different concepts, potentially just due to the things that you do. You know, if I'm like drinking and I'm thinking about, you know, food or something, I'm gonna think of different foods when I'm drinking, you know, like drunk food, you know, like pizza and stuff. You know, whereas like, you know, now that I'm rich, like, you know, when I'm sober, I think about caviar, you know. Kidding, I'm not rich, but.
Yeah, Carl Sagan supposedly came up with the idea for contact while stoned in the shower.
Oh, really? I know somebody it's in a big experimental psychology journal, Psychological Science. And it's like it's you know, you look at the impact factor, it's not super high, but it's a hard journal to get things. I got to study into there, and it was like definitely a pain in the ass, and like it, you know, we had a sexy spin to this thing. We called it the dark side of context and whatever. And but yeah, I know somebody that their idea for their paper in Psychological Science was them stoned in the shower.
But I guess the thing is, obviously people have insights under the influence of various different types of psychoactive substances. My concern was this sort of emphasis on the grandiose insights as opposed to the mundane ones. That's what I felt like people were being unfair to mundane insights, which are very valuable. And you see the same thing with AI, where people are like, oh, we're gonna use this to discover new types of physics or something like that. And maybe, I don't know. But the reality is, you know, as far as I know, last I checked, there isn't a single new way of creating carbon-carbon bonds, for example, that has been discovered by AI. There isn't like a really important chemical reaction that's been discovered by AI, but that doesn't mean it's not useful. It's extremely useful for like estimating a good time to cook a piece of chicken in the oven, or these mundane things. And so instead of appreciating mundane, valuable insights, everyone thinks that you have to discover the double helical structure of DNA or PCR or the structure of benzene or something like that, when for most people, the insight that they really need is going to be something. Well, it was funny actually, because the organizer of the conference spoke, and the example of an insight that she gave was that she was ruining her life smoking meth. And it's like, that's a damn valuable insight. That's an insight.
So we actually, part of that Minds project, we have this survey on, I never do survey research, but you know, this was something they wanted us to do, and I think it would be kind of useful if we're ever going to try to recreate that study in the 60s where they got like architects and engineers and mathematicians together to take LSD and then to think about the problems that they have and to try to come up with a new solution, which, you know, obviously it's a very biased, you know, sort of study, but one thing we were wanting to do is try to find the parameters. If we're ever going to try to recreate this study, we wanted to find the parameters that could increase the chances of having an insight, but a tangible insight related to your work. That's specifically what the survey is on. It's not about a personal insight like, oh, I realized I should quit my job. It's not, you know, oh, I had a bad relationship with my parents. It was more like, what did you find in your work that you think could be, even if you didn't necessarily apply it, but like, oh, if I like reorganize things, you know, if you're an architect and I reorganized, you know, the hallways here and here, like that would actually produce a really efficient fire exit while producing this beautiful, you know, building or something. Like that's the type of thing that we want. And yeah, I mean, and that's not, and that maybe that's on the mundane scale, you know, of insights where it's like, okay, it's not like something crazy, but this helped this person. You know what's actually really funny about that though is we were initially paying people for this survey because it was like, you know, it can take like 30 minutes, and AI has fucked up the whole thing, dude. We got 10,000 bot responses, and like there's probably some real responses in there that we just can't sift through. Like the AI does a damn good job responding to these surveys, and it's like, yeah, it's like if you're somebody where it costs like, you know, 5 cents to like send an AI bot to fill out your survey, like they're making a shitload of money. Yeah, what does that end up being? Is that a 300% profit? Something like that, yeah. It's like a crazy, yeah, so like we can't pay people anymore. So if, you know, this part goes on, anybody who sees our survey, please fill it out. Sorry, we can't pay you. We need more people to fill it out. Yeah.
I'm excited. Yeah, I think it's very much worth studying, and it's certainly not that I don't think insights are possible. I know that they are. It's just I wanted to temper
enthusiasm. That, my friend, the stoned shower idea, it got into psychological science. This is going to be very like important to people in that field. It's not going to be like, it wasn't some huge breakthrough. They just mixed up two ideas together from different paradigms, from behavioral paradigms, and then they came up with a really cool question and then like put it out there. It didn't, change the game of like medicine or anything like that. But again, we don't know what the next, finding will turn into the next like medical breakthrough or whatever technological breakthrough. We never know that, but even these like kind of mundane insights, I think, can be really important, at least for within a field, and potentially, they could extend to larger things. Did you see that David Nutt kind of confirmed that Crick took acid and I don't know if in that article it was truly confirmed that he saw the double helix, because like that's always been a thing that people will claim, but I don't think it was ever fully confirmed, right?
I spoke about how I'm very skeptical of this. I didn't realize that David Nutt made this. I mean, people have said it. There have been stories.
So what it was that, he wrote and said that, he was having dinner with Watson in like 2014, and he said like, so, what was he saying? It was something like, why did Crick get into like, neuroscience and consciousness and all this type of stuff? And he was like, it was that damn LSD or something like that. It was the damn psychedelics or something along those lines is what Watson ended up saying, which, they kind of, also in this article that David Nutt wrote was like...
Watson, who's in the Epstein files.
Oh, no way.
Oh, yeah. Not surprising.
Actually, maybe I should be surprising. That dude was, racist, misogynistic. People are... There's some lower people is definitely what he thought. What's actually interesting? I saw this recently. So we're talking about the hippocampus. There's this whole thing. Do you know Andrew Huxley? Oh wait, not Andrew Huxley. It's the Huxley. Maybe it's two generations. Andrew Huxley was the one who got the Nobel Prize for the Hodgkin-Huxley equation. Who was, I think, half brother or something. Half brother of Aldous Huxley. But it's a whole family of like scientists.
Yeah, there's Thomas Henry Huxley.
Thomas Henry Huxley. That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. There's what's known as the Great Hippocampus Hypothesis or something. And there's this whole thing about how, this one guy, I think the last name is Owen, was trying to say evolution couldn't exist and that, every animal was created perfectly by God and blah, blah, blah. And the whole thing about that was, that he was kind of denying, that there's anatomical similarity between, non-human primates and humans, and saying that, only humans have a hippocampus minor. And then there's a couple other things that he was saying that, that is different about the human brain. The hippocampus minor is just like, I think it's just like on the wall of like a ventricle or something like that. It turns out it's not even like it might not even be like a proper structure or something. But anyways, the whole thing is that, they were saying that like, he was basically saying like this makes humans special, and that and then Thomas Henry Huxley was like, no, actually this does exist in like monkeys and chimps and whatever, and like obviously this guy Owen lost, and like evolution has like won out for the most part, but there were some arguments in there that are like from I think Thomas Henry Huxley that they got a little racist a little bit, like saying that like lower humans are like comparing lower humans to like non-human primates, and as if like basically what they're saying is non-white people, right? And saying that these non-white people, well, look, they are very similar, and like I don't know, it got a little it gets a little racist, but it's a really interesting sort of thing that like devolved into this like people just like making jokes about each other in theater, which was it kind of makes science a little bit more fun sometimes, Yeah.
The Francis Crick thing, I'm skeptical because the work was done in 1953, so it's not chronologically impossible.
Maybe not LSD, but yeah.
But it would mean he was one of the first people in England. He would have been a really early adopter, and it would mean he tried it before Aldous Huxley, before Timothy Leary, it would mean that he was really, it's not chronologically impossible, but he would have had to have been at the cutting edge of people taking LSD.
Dude, I mean, that's like a point that I've never actually heard that. It's like seems like a very obvious point that people should bring up. But again, sometimes people, like myself included, aren't thinking critically about these things sometimes.
Because it would be cool. Wouldn't it be cool to imagine?
You
And
know?
of course, you also have to incorporate Rosalind Franklin's contributions, where even the idea of this aha moment and this insight, it's like insight based on someone's carefully conducted X-ray crystallography.
There's still a need, again, for having a strong set of knowledge before you can find a solution within that set of knowledge. And I talked to somebody once where it was like, well, no, I came up with this genius idea of how to test psychedelics, and now we're doing it some funder. And it was just like, your ideas, I'm sorry, not that great. But it was, definitely something that people want to. But again, I feel like they think that their idea is really good and must be true, and it's like they probably illusory truth affected themselves, especially under the effects of a psychedelic. And I think that it's something that I think we have to, this noetic quality, especially from expounding upon an idea under the effects of a psychedelic, it really does ramp up this fluency. If I haven't illusory truth affected myself, which we'll find out hopefully in a couple of years, then I think this is a mechanism by which psychedelics can enhance truthiness without actually enhancing the ability to find an insight necessarily.
It was awesome.
Yeah.
I think this also coincides with us losing light entirely. Yeah. I think that, are there any final, I'll link to any work that you're doing, any final notes?
Be real tight, because I'm pretty sure that could, Maps had originally linked it, and then we were actually, we wanted to keep payment, so we were trying to just send the survey around internally to various people, and then Maps posted it on their Facebook, and then the bots came back in, and so now we've pulled payment, and there's just a link.
Yeah, any links, we'll post them.
Well, tight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, and if you're around this weekend, let's kick it, dude.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.